As Kate said, I lead a five-way. Well, it's 4 universities and the state government Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, our funding agency. We've just clocked up our 3rd year in existence. So I'm based at the University of Southern Queensland, but I actually work for this 4-university partnership in the University of Queensland Business Economics and Law School, Central Queensland University out of Rockhampton, and James Cook out of Cairns and the Cairns Institute. And we organise our work and research into 5 sort of key areas, such as economic tools, innovation, value chains, policy, and then we really focus a lot on using the strength of 3 regionally placed universities in the translation and impact or engagement of that research. I suppose we've got about 25 projects in that sort of 5 theme under those 5 themes. These are sort of the key projects there, and it's been a very there is a bit of diversity. It's not just economics. There's ecology. There's agritourism, diversification. There's a bit of law in it as well. But yeah, it's been an interesting group to wrangle with, and I think it's just starting to kick into stride really. And I'll talk a little bit about those projects in the context of regional development and natural resource management, environment, and so forth today. I really sort of want to just touch on 3 sort of key topics, or 3 areas in my short presentation today, just the findings from a few of the projects in this space, look at a bit of a local government response case study to regional development and environment, and just touch on that role of government and NGOs, which this session is obviously all about. A little bit of background from myself. I come from a Western Queensland sheep property and left that in the early 90s after I left school, and I always relate to this story, and I apologise to those who've heard from me about this before, but my introduction to a career in agriculture was having to kill 6,000 sheep and being paid to do it. And that was a massive policy failure, and it's still Australia's biggest policy failure in the reserve wool price collapse. I also then, when I've lived in China for sort of 18 years as working in agriculture and regional development there. I'm actually a Chinese literature graduate originally, and then use that language to sort of work on projects that worked for the Australian wool industry. And whilst I was working with the Australian wool industry, I worked with the Australian Land Care Management Group, or ARMS as it was then, I looked after the environmental and sustainability aspects of the Australian wool as a product, as a brand. And we developed sort of campaigns and so forth. And one of the most successful ones, or the most successful one we had, was working back with that ARMS group, Tony Gleeson and co, which obviously Nelson knows very well. Nelson Quinn knows very well, the other speaker in this session. And yeah, we convinced a Japanese retailer, after offering them 10 different sort of environmental stories for their consumer-facing campaigns, and they chose the ARMS story as the one they liked the most. And I think, looking back or reflecting on that success back in 2005-06, what was their sort of motivation on choosing ARMS, and it was really down to ISO accreditation. Not that every landholder, but that system had an ISO accreditation and recognisability. And I've kept in touch with that group ever since, and that's possibly why I'm speaking today as much as the position I hold at RICO. But I've always, and I probably bore people like Greg Leach a lot at AgForce on using wool industry analogies, but it's at least our 2nd or 3rd oldest industry in European settlement, and has had some of the bigger, more developed market systems and signals. And we might talk about that near the end, and sort of where government and NGOs and industry bodies play a role and should not play. Moving on to sort of our research, I think that one of the key ones, and relating to a few of the really excellent presentations I've seen today in this forum, and I must congratulate the organisers. It's been really good to be a part of and to watch and to get the opportunity. Central Queensland University leads a beef, our value chain sort of research area, and we've looked at credence factors in beef. Queensland is the half of Australia's beef herd, and a big component of our rural economies. I live in the Darling Downs in Toowoomba, which is probably at the most eastern end of one of the biggest value-adding corridors in Australian agriculture, with 97 feedlots between Toowoomba and Roma, with more than 2,000 head. This picture is from the Gulf country up in the north, or the calf factory, as the industry likes to call it. And we were really looking at what are those sort of credence factors and what is their impact. Particularly, we were focused on international, but COVID changed a lot of that, the scope, and we have focused in COVID times on a lot of Australian consumer demand and consumption trends, but really trying to dive into those soft attributes of what the value is of things like animal welfare. I would say that, looking at the findings there on that little green box to the left around beef value chains and credence, that our beef consumers have seemed happy with quality, and there's strong demand for leaner meats in the Australian context. Remembering Australia's probably moved from over 60 kilos per head in the 1980s per annum to under 26 kilos per head per annum in consumption. If you reflect that on with avocados, for example, avocados, we were probably eating about 0.8 of a kilo per person in 2000, and we now eat 3.8 kilos per person, which is a real reflection on dietary and societal change. But in our finding, animal welfare around consumer demand has been important, and this reflects also in some Meat and Livestock Australia studies that we worked closely with as well in key markets and exports. There was little willingness to pay for lower CO2. We could probably put that down to a range of things. Maybe it's a lack of understanding of what that actually means at a consumer level. Remembering many of our consumers, we're still educating on the difference between a grass and grain-fed product, as well as many other attributes. Hormone-free is important. It's probably, it is legislated in places, markets like China, our largest export market, and organic is less so. So I think that looking at a few sort of value chain sort of aspects on what we're talking about today is if we're looking at, well, we want to have these great outcomes, how does, and we often get to the conversation, well, consumers will pay, or, these things need to be considered. A few other projects that we do, we looked at regional innovation and we've looked at environmental offsets in some depth with the UQ team in the Granite Belt region, particularly at adoption and producer behaviour around navigating different regulatory settings. That work's sort of evolved into another project with AgriFutures coming on this year. And that's been, I still think that that's a big space to work in and very related to your topics today. We've also looked at very early on in different cluster fencing models in central and southwestern Queensland, mainly local government versus state. And you might ask, well, what is the issue there related to today's topic? Well, it is becoming a big biodiversity topic. And we're starting to branch out from the economics of how we rolled out that infrastructure into what is the biodiversity impact of this infrastructure as much as the production efficiency. And we're also seeing some change in grazing trends from a lot of interest in returning to sheep and more sheep meat-led enterprises vis-a-vis cattle or beef enterprises. But again, early stages of that work. The last thing is third on the sort of list there has been, and we've mentioned a little bit in my bio about Future Drought Fund, which is a new program obviously launched with much fanfare in the last sort of 12 to 18 months. We're working with three future drought projects at the moment, the Drought Resilient Leaders, Drought Innovation Hubs, of which we're involved with two, one out of Townsville and James Cook led, the other out of Toowoomba and is USQ led. And then the third one is a community drought resilient planning program, which is only just commencing. We're working with DAF and Queensland Reconstruction Authority on that. I think the Future Drought Fund is obviously a source of funding for researchers, but also communities, enterprises and individuals to look at this very important space around dealing with climate change. If we were having a glass of wine later on the day, I might have another political take on it, but we'll keep it above board today. I think another area I'd really like to touch on briefly has been sort of what has been we've come across in a community response, and a lot of today has been talking around at farm and enterprise level. And agriculture's right, every family needs a farmer, but every farmer needs a regional town. And I think that looking at how communities can develop has been a really interesting one in this space. One project we've been working on with Quilpie Shire, which is 10 hours or so, 950k from Brisbane, with a prediction, or just a very sad trend that we're all familiar with, that 8 people out of 650 or so will leave Quilpie by 2026. What can they do? And this town has come up with a place-based solution, which is a circular economy solution involving solar distilled water that goes into a craft brewery and then has a nutrient loop with an aquaponics fish and vegetable production. So it's and that's an artist's impression, if you like, of a redeveloped site. It meets a lot of goals, both state and federal, in terms of what they want, in terms of innovation, in terms of sustainability, in terms of water usage, and so forth. It takes, an existing asset that's being unused, which is the block of land there on the left, and turning it into something that has a tourism as well as private enterprise and could attract up to 37 jobs. And we all know the language of government is often jobs. But really, this project, as well conceived as it is, does struggle to get anywhere with state or federal governments, and we're really going to keep pushing it through the Future Drought Fund, because we truly believe it's innovative and has a lot of potential, not only for Quilpie but a lot of other regional towns in arid and isolated Australia, as well as internationally. I think, just to finish off on the role of governments or NGOs, and I've put a Gundawindi football field up there because I think we sometimes really do lose our way in what the role of each of these important bodies is. And is it setting out the playing field and setting up the rules, or is it refereeing? Is it playing? Sometimes we have entrepreneurial governments that often want to be playing in these teams. I don't want to, I was trying to make this light, being a Friday afternoon session after a long week and in COVID times. And, I don't want to compare codes like rugby league and rugby union and be so obtuse. But, often the former struggles as a product, I think, because of the intervention of the referee. The latter might be a bit more free flowing, but it still has rules coming down from the top that clubs may or may not accept. And I think that's a big analogy that we see today in carbon markets. And again, I revert back to my wool industry, exit, I suppose, coming back from a massive misuse, or, a real misconception where they lost their economic mechanism and went for an industry-led floor price scheme that led to a disaster. And I think also we need to reflect on that our agricultural demand is largely international. I applaud you for having a very strong comparative session in this forum, because when I led the Australian wool industry and we had animal welfare as a key topic of mulesing back 10, 15 years ago, most of our hot points and real angst came from Northern Europe and a little bit from the US, and nothing from Asia. And Asia was then our strongest process, and still is our strongest processing site for wool, and one of our bigger consumers and our future demand. So I think those are also key points for reflection. And in the context, and to finish, as my time is nearly up, I think, we have this very strong, or, I suppose some of the solutions lie in complex, what I call sort of complex collaboration. We still have these heritage policy structures around federation. We're still arguing, I suppose, old arguments around neoliberalism and Keynesian planning. The reductionism topic comes up a lot in this argument around how do we put in, things like environmental offset marketplaces. We're really trying to get adoption going and understand regulation and market signals. I really think definition of roles needs to be revisited and looked at a lot. I really like to ask the question always, what is a good carbon credit or environmental offset? And I think, where that consumer demand and production decisions have friction, we need to understand that as well. And I've always found that the premiums are really hard to quantify in a value chain for credence attributes, dating back from, working in that time with the Australian wool industry and telling the arms story into Japan and Korea, as well as other markets. So I know I've probably ranged wide and far there in that short talk, but from a regional development perspective, agricultural value chains is such an important part of them. And I think that's been our lens. We've looked through a lot of this, but also looking at local government being entrepreneurial, such as in the Quilpie case, and how they can proceed for those communities is another aspect we're very interested in. So thank you again for your time.